Welcome to this Thought Leader session in which Henry Chesbrough shares insights on the value of openness in the COVID-19 era. So my name is Chris McPhee. I'm an innovation management specialist from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. As with many of us in the ISPIM community, open innovation is a key theme in my work. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Henry Chesbrough, who is perhaps best known as the father of open innovation, based on his 2003 book. Now, Henry, I know, we've talked about how many people are there, but you can't see them, which is unfortunate, but I did a bit of homework to assure you that this will be an attentive audience. So I went back to the past 10 years of ISPIM presentations, and just looking at the titles and the abstracts of those presentations, I found the term that you've coined, open innovation, has been used by our community more than 2,000 times.
Oh, and great.
And just in this event alone, I looked at all the papers, and so looking at the actual full text of it, it's been used 650 times just in this event alone in the papers. So, as the father of open innovation, I hope you feel like you're really with family today, even if you can't see them. So let me just round out the introduction by saying that Henry has been a professor at UC Berkeley since 2003. He recently joined the Luis University in Rome as the Meo Tecnimo Professor of Open Innovation. He has also just published a new book with Oxford University Press titled Open Innovation Results, Going Beyond the Hype and Getting Down to Business. You can find a link to that book in the conference app, either in the bookstore or on Henry's Thought Leader page. His talk today will discuss open innovation in the COVID-19 pandemic, and will draw from this new book as well. So just as a reminder, I think we all know now, if we want to chat, do it in the chat box. If you have a question for Henry, do it in the Q&A, and please vote for questions you like, because that'll help us select them when we get to the Q&A part. And for the next 20 minutes then, Henry, please, over to you.
Chris, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be back with all my friends and colleagues at ISPIM, and I'm sorry that we can't all be together physically, but maybe soon. So let me get myself over to share my screen. So thanks to Chris's introduction, you already know my goal for the next 20 minutes, which is to connect open innovation and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm going to weave together a couple of threads, and I'm going to end with a call for more infrastructure to get ready for the resurgence of the virus should it take place. So let me, and I want to begin with what I see as a real puzzle for those of us who study innovation. And that is the pace of technology is accelerating. And that there is even a very common thread among many of us around these exponential technologies. And it's often observed that the lifespan of Fortune 500 companies is shortening, which reflects the accelerating pace of change. And if you think about that, that should lead to an era of abundance, that we're getting more and more all the time. And yet, when you look at economic data, and even before the pandemic, this was true. It's even more true today. Productivity growth is really slowing down. And so in the United States, this is a long-range view going back 70 years. And you can see the red trend line versus the blue actual line that shows the growing gap in productivity growth, which is not consistent with this accelerating pace of technological change. If you look across all the G7 countries, you see the same pattern of productivity growth slowing down in each of them. Even Canada, Chris, is slowing down. So why is this? Well, I think some of it is that we are living off of investments we've made in the past, and that we're not keeping up our innovation infrastructure, if you will. Here is a long-term graph of federal R&D spending as a share of GDP in the economy. And you can see that it's going down quite a bit over time. Another facet, I think, is a growing gap in productivity between the very best companies and the rest of companies. whether it's in manufacturing or services, the best are actually continuing to improve productivity quite substantially, but they're getting farther and farther ahead of the rest. And when we look at productivity data across an economy, we're seeing everyone, not just the best. So let's think about turning the question around. Instead of asking why productivity growth is slowing down today, let's turn it the other way. Why was productivity growth so high in the past? And here I think it gets back to this idea of infrastructure. I would also say training and skills development have been very important to building the conditions for productivity growth. So that's something that we used to do and we've really stopped doing. And as we think about policy responses to the pandemic, most of what we're doing is trying to supplement or replace income from people who've been laid off. I don't see much discussion of how to build and rebuild an infrastructure to support growth in the future. And if we look inside organizations, we have a similar condition in my judgment. And many of us in the innovation community love studying all the new shiny objects that are forever coming into the innovation domain. AI and blockchain and big data and digital twins and Innovation 4.0 and so on. What I think we sometimes lose sight of is the underlying infrastructure to support the dissemination and absorption of these ideas. And if we want to get results, we have to look at all of these facets of innovation. And I think if we go back to a little bit of history to the last financial crisis, open innovation itself was quite new in those days. And I'm sad to share with you that I think many organizations used the rhetoric of open innovation as a reason to cut their internal spending. So although open innovation is not about outsourcing all of your R&D to somebody else and hollowing out your internal capabilities, I think some of that did take place in response to that financial crisis in the name of open innovation. And then when the recovery did come back, many of these companies that had made those cuts were less able to grow back. And they had literally damaged their own innovation infrastructure. So if we think about open innovation as an innovation process, it really has a lot of new inputs that increase broadly the intake of new technologies, whether that's from crowds or universities or startups, intermediaries. All of these widen the intake to the process to produce proofs of concept that, if they meet some early success in the market, can then be scaled up by the business units in the back end of our organization. But for those of us who teach about processes inside companies, if you push more things into a process, but you don't debottleneck the other parts of the process and increase their capacity, putting in more intake can result in simply a lot of congestion. And you can create kind of the equivalent of a log jam, where you're not getting more things through your innovation process, you're just clogging the system. And this is particularly true for the support functions that have to support open innovation. And many organizations I work with tell me that they're often surprised when they're getting started at all the support function activities that are needed, and rarely do companies provide extra funding to support these activities. So we unfortunately don't create the additional capacity to manage this intake. So to summarize, we still need to think about generating new innovation, absolutely, and there's a lot of value in openness for doing that. But that's not enough to actually get results. We also need to disseminate those results and move people around to move the knowledge where it needs to be. And then we also have to absorb it and put it to work. And that involves both training, but also integration and alignment with the other parts of the organization. So with this as background, I'm about halfway through let's turn to the pandemic. So we need to stop the disease, but that's not all. We want to start the recovery. And in many of the countries where you're based, this is already happening. In the US, it's fair to say we're a little behind. But even that's not enough, because we know from past pandemics that there is a very good chance that we'll have a reoccurrence of the disease. So this is not a one-shot situation. We've got to be ready for the reoccurrence as well. And open innovation can help in all three of these phases. In stopping the disease, I had the great pleasure of doing an article just in April that was done in the fastest time ever. Even academia can move fast in a pandemic. And the idea in that paper was the idea of using open innovation not simply to increase one's capability or to lower the cost of innovation, but to focus on the possibility of doing faster processes with open innovation. And why can open innovation increase the speed? Because you can often start in the middle when you're doing a collaboration with others, where each of you bring to the collaboration the results you've already developed and achieved. So you don't have to go back to the beginning. You can start in the middle. And a good example here would be many of the vaccine candidates that are being tested now for COVID-19 actually have already been tried and in some cases approved for other uses, for other indications. So we know the safety profile of these compounds in humans already. We don't have to go back to the beginning. Instead, we can focus on the efficacy and will these things actually work to develop antibodies for COVID-19. And beyond the vaccines, if we think about the surrounding technologies in the pandemic that are crucial to controlling the rate of social transmission of the diseases, like personal protective equipment, we're learning a lot about these, and open innovation can help here as well. For example, masks and hand sanitizers can be made at home or can be made by others who repurpose their production, a perfume company making hand sanitizer, apparel companies making masks, and even in hospital equipment like ventilators. Manufacturers like Medtronic have been opening up and sharing not just the IP, but the actual engineering drawings for these designs. Others at MIT and elsewhere have created open source ventilators that they have created and shared. And so all of this is allowing us to greatly increase both our speed and our agility in the face of the pandemic. So then the second phase, how do we get going with the recovery and where does open innovation fit? Well, one of the things in the recovery is we're not going back, we're only going forward. And that means some parts of the economy are going to recover quickly and others won't. So this is a time when companies need to do a lot of probing to explore where in the economy we see actual activity and appetite for purchasing now. And one of the benefits of open innovation, particularly if you collaborate with others, is you can often use the same amount of capital to get more shots on goal or launch more probes in more parts of the market. And initially in the recovery, there will be weak signals of where the demand looks like it's going to respond versus the areas where demand is going to remain quite sluggish for some time. So we need to use our probes to find and build on the weak signals that we get. So as I said, we're not going to go backward, we're only going to go forward. Think about where to focus your resources, your attention, and yes, your open innovation efforts to hunt for the next normal. And one area that I think we're seeing not in this conference, as well as what I'm seeing in universities and many other places, is digital transformation, where because of the pandemic, we have had a shock to the system that has practically overnight dramatically shifted many of our work processes to become much more digital. And the usual sources of resistance inside of organizations have themselves had to adapt and adjust. So digital, as we've known for some time, is not simply about making an app. It's really about changing the way you work and then providing the reskilling and the training, think back to our infrastructure discussion, to enable them to be successful and effective with these new techniques. Then finally, I don't hope that this happens, but it's quite possible that after we beat down the disease, after we start our recovery, we may see a resurgence. So now is the time to make the investments to manage the possibility of that resurgence, both as societies and as organizations. So within organizations, think about your processes and how to strengthen them so you can be more effective. And then think about if you have to go back to working at home for some period, increase the support you provide for that. In working with your partners in your ecosystems, be very active and engaged with those partners and look for where the uptake is really happening and how can we be resilient if we have a shortage of toilet paper again or masks again. How can we be more resilient this time? And the same idea about weak signals for the recovery also applies to where problems begin to develop. If we can identify the problems early and then share them widely, we're in a position to take action. And this is also true in the public sector. We need to make the investments as a society to be ready for the resurgence. And the good news for all of us is that this is a good time to make these investments because interest rates are at historic low levels. This is not even a new idea.
We have to put in place an infrastructure, not just here at home, but globally, that allows us to see it quickly, isolate it quickly, respond to it quickly. So that if and when a new strain of flu, like the Spanish flu, crops up 5 years from now or a decade from now, we've made the investment. And we're further along to be able to catch it.
Back in 2014, President Obama was talking back then about making investments to be ready for and managing the pandemic. Unfortunately, some officials in his administration and many officials in the Trump administration didn't follow through. So as you all know, the US has had a terrible pandemic. And part of it was we simply weren't ready and we didn't make the investments we needed to. So let's make sure that we learn from that lesson as we face the possibility of another resurgence this time. A more positive story comes from Genoa, Italy. 2 years ago, they had a very important bridge that joined the two sides of the river collapse. And it was a scandal because the bridge wasn't that old, but it hadn't been properly maintained and had decayed. And so it was kind of a metaphor for not keeping one's infrastructure maintained. But this past April, the bridge was rebuilt and reopened in just 2 years. And was an example of the public administration authorities centralizing responsibility and authority for all of the approvals that were needed to get this bridge built and up and running again. And they were able to rebuild an entirely new bridge in less than 2 years. So it now is a symbol of what is possible if we focus on really developing our infrastructure. So in conclusion, I would say I'm cautiously optimistic for us. The vaccines are indeed moving fast. We're getting much better at antigen and antibody tests. We're getting very good at contact tracing. And the personal protective equipment is no longer chronically short where it needs to be. And also as societies, we're developing new social technologies around social distancing, around wearing masks, around providing extra protection for seniors and others who are really at higher risk for the disease. So I think these are lessons we will keep with us as we go forward. So it's a pleasure to be with you and have a chance to share these books. And I hope I've succeeded in explaining why the new book makes a contribution beyond the ones that have been done before. Thank you very much. Would look forward very much to your comments and discussion. Chris, back to you.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was wonderful. I mean, talk about a timely presentation and in terms of the fit for this audience and this conference theme and basically what we're all living with and working with at the moment. So thank you very
Indeed.
much for these insights. As you've been talking, I've been keeping an eye on the Q&A, and there was one, well, there were two questions I'm going to combine a bit here. And so one of the questions was about the different industries and whether some may be, better set up than others for dealing with open innovation. So I was wondering if you had seen any sort of patterns across industries. And then as an example, someone has also mentioned medical innovations, which has been kind of a headline in the COVID crisis, but then they also have the challenge of being bound by ethical and quality standards. And so I just wondered if you wanted to touch on those questions.
Right, and maybe if prompt me again for the second part of that, the medical innovation part, Chris, if in my answer I don't get to it. I do see some differences across industry, but I think what is more important is within industries, I'm seeing a growing gap between the best and the rest, which I presented a little bit about in the 20 minutes I had. Think about artificial intelligence. There are some companies doing amazing things with artificial intelligence right now. But for every one of those, there are dozens or hundreds who haven't even got their data organized in such a way that they could train an AI algorithm to do a better job of a particular process. And that's just one example of many where within industries, there are a few companies who are really at the forefront, really moving forward quite effectively, but pulling away from everybody. So we used to think about, particularly as economists, to look at differences across industries. What I'm saying is I think the within variation is now greater than the between variation. And I think that's where more of our attention needs to go. And for those companies who aren't at the forefront, how do you think about catching up, learning from, and improving? And in some cases, can you think of ways of collaborating to help you in that catch-up process? And what can you offer to somebody who is farther ahead that you could work with them, learn from them, and improve yourself? Now, the second part of the medical innovation. One of the areas that I see in pharma is a willingness in the pandemic to suspend business as usual. And a good example would be intellectual property rules. I already mentioned Medtronic releasing IP rights to its ventilators. Ordinarily, these are profitable businesses and Medtronic polices its IP as well as anybody. But they've taken the step of opening that up to increase the supply in a very distributed, bottom-up way. Medical compounds that are developed for one indication are now being tested for other indications. This is sometimes called repurposing. This is a practice that I personally hope will continue after the pandemic. I think all too often, pharma companies work hard on compounds for one market, but if it doesn't work, they simply abandon the compound and leave it on the shelf and don't allow others to look at the data and see where else it might be useful. So those are some examples where I think even after the crisis, I hope we can change the way we do business.
Excellent. Here's a challenging question, because I think I mentioned as the ISPIM community, we're very much, maybe you could say we're believers in the open innovation. So Mark Karahan is from Berlin, and he's wondering where we are all, why we're not in Berlin. But he says, okay, your work has been inspiring people for 20 years, but why do you think we still haven't managed to adopt open innovation approaches at large scale?
I've thought about this some, and happily with the ISPIM community, there are many of us that are thinking about these things. So I don't claim to have the answer. I think this is something that will emerge from the work of many of us. One thing I hope you take from my presentation is it isn't enough to focus on the generation of technologies. I think we've all been a little bit guilty of paying too much attention to the new stuff and not paying enough attention to the broader dissemination and absorption of the stuff. And until we get those facets included, we won't get open innovation at large scale. So, and I would say something I've learned since writing the book is it's not that hard to describe an open innovation model. And it's pretty easy to give a number of examples of organizations doing very cool things using open innovation thinking. What's much harder is to change an entire organization to get them to do it. You have to unlearn some things in order to learn these new things. I even have a chapter in the book on Procter & Gamble, who for many years was one of our examples of, boy, they're really doing it well. But in the book, I look at Procter & Gamble's revenues in the last 10 years, and to my surprise, a company that had really mastered open innovation in the 2000s has really had trouble growing its revenue in the last decade. So they understand open innovation, they have processes to do it, they do it well, and they're having trouble growing. So that suggests that even once you get it, you have to sustain it over time. And when new CEOs come in, new priorities are established for the organization, these things can diminish the effects of open innovation.
Last night, we all made a good effort having a social event as part of the conference via Zoom. So we had some very good conversations, and people were talking about what they were looking forward to in the conference. And frankly, this session was one of them that came up. And so I was, asking people about what they thought about it at that point. And so here's a question that came out of that discussion, and that was, this person was asking about the people of open innovation. And I wondered if this was, something also to consider as we move forward in this, post-COVID-19 area or during COVID-19 area in terms of the importance of facilitation, coordination, connection, in terms of, what are the sort of people skills behind it?
It's a really good point. There is a model of leadership in open innovation. When you're collaborating with other organizations, you don't have formal authority over them. Instead, you must encourage them. You must enlist them. You must offer to them. And you have responsibility without authority. So there is a whole different leadership model that comes on the people side of open innovation. One thing that all of us can do, and I did this yesterday in preparation for our time today, I went on LinkedIn. And I did a search on people on LinkedIn using open innovation as a search term. And I got more than 600,000 people on LinkedIn who have open innovation somewhere in their profile. And in the pandemic, I did the same search for jobs. And even though there's a lot of recession right now in the economy of many countries, there were 4,000 jobs on LinkedIn yesterday that had open innovation as part of the job requirement. So it's worth learning these skills, and there's a growing network of people that are practicing them.
Well, that's excellent. Well, and I guess a large number of people in this audience will have open innovation in their LinkedIn profiles, I would imagine. I guess
yes, I think you're right. Many of those people are on this seminar right now and are members of ISPIM. Absolutely.
They're all looking at their breadcrumbs in LinkedIn saying, hey, Henry Chesbrough was visiting my page. We're almost out of time, so I just wondered whether you had any other advice for open innovation practitioners going forward.
One thing I've been putting a lot of time on is connecting theory and practice. We have an annual conference in December called the World Open Innovation Conference. And for people practicing open innovation in industry, I encourage you to reach out to your local and regional universities and help them train people to do these things and offer your experience as possible case study sites. And then for those of us in the ISPIM community, we have to keep this fresh. We have to make it relevant to today. And we have to think about dissemination and absorption not just the bright new shiny objects.
That's excellent. Well, here we are. You're going to have to leave people wanting more because we are out of time. I just want to thank you. Want to thank you so much for this great session. It was wonderful. Thank you very much, Henry. And
Well,
yeah,
thanks everybody for your time and attention. And Chris, thanks for being a great moderator for the session.
You're very welcome. There's virtual applause all over. So thank you very much.
All right.
Okay.
Have a good conference, everyone.
Thank you.